as sort of the essence of, the core essence of Buddhist practice is to work with the mind and to shape the mind, improve the condition of the mind. This is what we're working with. There's nothing else to be worked with other than the mind. And so these preliminary prayers, let me just, reiterate. So the mind is what is the ultimate source of our suffering. It's nothing external, truly. It's all arising through this highly dependent matrix of causes and conditions that we're a part of, all motivated by minds, all triggered by our given the potential to create events by minds. So minds, so in our lineage especially, we are advised by our teachers to, when we study and practice, every time we study and practice in a session such as this, or your morning session, your daily session, you're advised to work with the mind in a particular sequence of thoughts that, in the West, we can call them prayers or aspirations, but they're a particular sequence that our lineage advises, and they're called the 6 preparatory practices. And if you Google 6 preparatory practices, you can find that. I won't go over it now out of concern for time. I don't want to take a lot of it, but so just as a beginning to remind us all that these prayers are not meant to be ritual or to make you. These prayers they are put together in our lineage for a specific set of ideas, thoughts that we are meant to remind ourselves of in order to focus our intention and focus our motivation as we enter into the practice or the study that we're about to do. So with that in mind, so as you contemplate that in your own time, I do really recommend everybody become familiar with the 6 preparatory practices, which are what essentially these prayers that we're going to do and do each week are really meant to be done every day when you begin your day. All right, with that in mind, we will start with taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. And as we do this, we'll do this in English. It's advised that we imagine the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha sort of in the space around us, and also the sentient beings. We're meant to be beacons of inspiration and leaders towards enlightenment as well, for the legions of sentient beings that surround us, our family and friends and strangers, enemies, and so forth. So what's happening when we say this is that the blessings of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and our own teachers, the blessings, we're meant to envision them falling upon us and saturating our being, while at the same time, all of our wrong thinking is dissolved and just disappears. Leave it like that. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the positive potential I create by listening to teachings and the other paramitas, may I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the positive potential I create to listening to teachings and the other paramitas, may I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all beings. And in case you're not familiar with the term paramitas, those are the bodhisattva attitudes that we're meant to cultivate. And that's another Google search if you want to look into the paramitas. And third repetition, I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha, through the positive potential I create by listening to teachings and the other paramitas. may I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. Then we refresh our minds before we do as we're getting ready to do the four immeasurables. These are four immeasurable thoughts of compassion and altruism that we are meant to cultivate. Our lineage is a Mahayana lineage, and therefore the goal of our practice ultimately is to become Buddhas ourselves. And we do that through the practices we engage in, including shaping our minds to have warm-hearted, good wishes for all beings, no matter who or what they represent. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And just take a moment to envision yourself as working on a path to actually establish all sentient beings with whom you have a karmic connection. Your goal is to establish them in these fortunate states of being, all happiness, contentment. And then at this point in the preparatory practices, we dissolve the Buddha and all the sentient beings into our heart, and then sort of pop out what's called the refuge visualization, which is a very nice, elaborate array. You can, again, Google the refuge visualization, but it includes the Buddhas, all the Bodhisattvas, the lineage of method or compassion, and the lineage of wisdom. So it's sort of a host of beings that includes not only the teachers and the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, but the Dharma and what we call the triple gem. So envision in front of you and surrounding you all these marvelous beings with whom you are joining to create what we call the great vehicle, the Mahayana. And just be very happy that you're joining this movement of goodness and altruism. And with this host of benign, beneficial beings surrounding us, and on behalf of all the sentient beings who also surround us, we say the seven limb prayer as our acknowledgement of some specific ideas that we have, our attitudes towards the Dharma and the Buddhas, the teachers. So the seven limb prayer is: reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind, and present clouds of every type of offering, actual and mentally transformed. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time, and I rejoice and rejoice in the merits of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until samsara ends, and turn the wheel of Dharma for sentient beings. I dedicate the merit created by myself and others to the great enlightenment. And that's referring to the great enlightenment of all sentient beings. Again, our lineage is all about the liberation and enlightenment of every single sentient being that exists throughout the cosmos without bias. And so the Buddhas are very happy that we are on board with this great vision. And so with still this array of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, we make one more gesture to signal our commitment to being part of this movement through what's called the mandala offering. And it's got two sort of factors. You are generating with your visualization, your imagination, you're generating the most purified cosmos that you have the capacity to generate with your thoughts. Throughout all the cosmos, you're generating purified beings inhabiting it, purified environments, wonderful, creative, purified, wonderful, marvelous activities, all amazing, great, good things. This is your offering to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, that you visualize this and this is what you're working towards. So while imagining this amazingly purified, great, ultimate place, cosmos, we say, we'll do it in English, this ground is anointed by perfume and strewn with flowers. This is one version of what you could visualize, but I mean, you definitely personalize it. Adorned by Mount Meru, the 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine it as a Buddha field, and I offer it. May all beings enjoy such a pure land. And may you say the Sanskrit, please, to the Buddhas, asking them to accept this visualized offering. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niryatayami. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. How's everybody this morning? Good, I hope. I have myself a new drink here. I made some caffeinated espresso cafe Americano. So we'll see how this affects the lessons today.
It's only half calf.
It's oh, is it half calf?
Yeah.
Well, half calf is pretty caffy. But my God, it's delicious. You know you're drinking something. Okay. So pardon my
I was very excited about this.
yeah, pardon my drugged up state. Today we're going to begin a series of investigations into the mind, how it functions, the Buddhist model of the mind, Buddhist psychology. This is based on teachings by Khentrul Rinpoche in a book called Unveiling Your Sacred Truth. And it's 3 volumes, and what we're dealing with is volume 1, book 1. And in the study guide, I have a link to this book, but all of this stuff will also be in the study guides that we're doing. So we're going to gradually, step by step, increment by increment, because there's a lot of information here, begin to understand the model of the mind. There are meditative exercises that will go along with this, and also we'll learn the stages, all of the stages of meditation, the stages that we go through, to finally get to what was called a direct realization of emptiness, a direct realization of the actual nature of reality. So I'm very hopeful that this will be a lot of help for all of us. I'm very impressed with the way Khentrul Rinpoche presents this information. He makes it very clear. And so we're going to start with that today. And today what we're going to talk about is what is the mind? What is the mind itself in Buddhism? So between the body and the mind, we in our society, and perhaps throughout the world for the most part, tend to emphasize the body more than the mind. We tend to emphasize the world of physical things out there over the subjective experience of things in here. In general, there seems to be almost an overwhelming belief or inclination toward the experiential world of things, that the physical world is clearly the most important thing. I mean, if you just even look at how we function, how we behave, how we think about the world, when we're thinking about what's going to make us happy, right? We'll go, well, if I just have the right job, if I just have the right partner, if I just have the right house, and it's in the right place or the right country or the right state, if I just have the right kind of body, the right kind of haircut, I'll be happy. I mean, we're like this. We look at our advertisements. They're all this way. Advertisements are always selling us, here's where you can go to, be happy. Here's the clothes you can wear to look great. Here's the kind of body you should have that will be, the kind of body you want. And we're bombarded with this all the time. And so naturally, we have a tendency to think that our happiness is going to come from the stuff that's out here. When in reality, if we look at it, if we actually examine it, when we are happy, how are we actually experiencing that happiness? We're experiencing it as a conscious state. We are conscious of being happy. And so consciousness is synonymous with the mind in Buddhism. So in Buddhism, happiness actually is based in consciousness, not in what the physical world that seems to be out there. That those things can sort of stimulate a conscious response. And sometimes that conscious response is, happy. But the consciousness is where happiness resides. That's where we experience happiness. And we all know from our own experience that, when we find the right job, the perfect job, right? It only takes a little bit of time before that job is no longer quite the perfect job we thought it was. In some instances, it becomes hell on earth, and we have to get out of that job that we thought was so perfect. So we can see that what we thought was the perfect job maybe wasn't so much. Then we look at what we think would be the perfect partner for ourselves, right? So we find somebody who we think fills the bill. We spend some time with them. At first, it's great, it's wonderful. Then we really begin to realize that they're not exactly the person that we thought they were, that we projected onto them. There comes with that person a whole other package of qualities that we're either going to figure out how to learn to live with, or we're going to get very upset, very frustrated, and think, I need to get out of this relationship, I need another partner. This happens with everything. It happens with the perfect house, the perfect car. There's always going to be a point where we're going to find some sort of dissatisfaction, some kind of fault, something's going to go wrong. It happens all the time. And we know this. This is just the nature of things. The nature of the world out there is that it always changes. It's constantly changing. It has to be maintained, because if it's not maintained, it's going to deteriorate. And so there's a lot of frustration that comes with clinging on to or grasping on to things out there as being the source of our happiness. We tend to think if we could just manipulate everything in just the right way, we would be happy. But Buddhism's saying the thing we should not be trying to manipulate what's out there. We should be looking at our own mind, our own consciousness. So given the choice, most of us would prefer a life that's filled with happiness and joy, as opposed to a life that's filled with dissatisfaction, frustration, anger, and fear. When and if we recognize that the source of happiness, that the experience of happiness lies at the level of consciousness, lies at the level of the mind, then it becomes very clear that the mind is the most important phenomenon for us to understand. So this is where we start with the model of the mind. We start with what is the mind? And it's very surprising in our Western culture how little is actually known about the mind, is known about consciousness itself. Fortunately, there are these ancient traditions of Indian and Tibetan Buddhism that developed a very, very robust science of the mind centuries ago. And this is based on the work of yogis who sort of, they gave up everything to sort of practice, to understand what the mind was, follow the Buddha's teachings. I mean, the Buddha was, the first one in our era, in our eon, you might say, who introduced these techniques that these yogis then developed, and they developed this science of the mind. So what is the mind then? What is the mind? To understand the mind from a Buddhist perspective, we need to clear away some misconceptions that are commonly accepted in our society. And remember, this is just the Buddhist perspective. Nobody's asking anybody to believe this. We're just looking at what the perspective is, and then we're going to make our own decision based on our own practice, our own trying it out to see, see if it's logical, if it makes sense. So the biggest misconception is that the mind is the brain. This is the biggest misconception we have about the mind in Western society, that the mind is the brain. Many Westerners have the idea, based on current science, that the mind is an organ made of gray and white matter enclosed within the cranium that serves as the center of the nervous system. It's assumed to be the seat of consciousness, thought, memory, and emotion, the brain. Based on this assumption, neuroscientists examine and investigate the various neurons and synapses of the brain, trying to understand how it is that our conscious experience arises from that, how our conscious experience arises from the brain. And we've looked a little bit into this when we studied some current neuroscientists and their findings, and it was quite interesting. But none of them actually could prove that consciousness was arising from the brain itself. That consciousness was arising from the neurons and the synapses that connect the neurons. So far, the neuroscientists have not been successful in proving that. What neuroscientists have been able to identify is that there is a very close correlation between the electrical activity within the brain and corresponding experiences in the mind, corresponding experiences of consciousness. Khentrul Rinpoche says, this would suggest that there are two distinct types of phenomena that are capable of influencing each other. And those are matter and consciousness. Two distinct phenomena that are capable of influencing each other. When we talk about these two distinct phenomena in relation to ourselves, what we're referring to is the body, which is physical, and the mind, which is non-physical consciousness. So the body is physical matter, and the mind, according to Buddhism, is non-physical consciousness. These two are different, but they're related, and they have a mutual influence on one another. According to Buddhist psychology, the mind, or consciousness, is non-physical in nature. This means that it is not made up of particles, nor does it exist within a specific location in space and time. For instance, just if you were to say, imagine, your backyard when you were a kid. Well, your consciousness sort of is not limited to by what's around here, what's directly around you now, but your consciousness can go back to, oh, I remember my backyard when I was a kid. Oh, yeah. I remember what it looked like. All that stuff. All of us can do this. So the mind's not limited to being right here, right now, in terms of what it can be aware of. So that's important. The body is not like that. The body is definitely limited to where it is. Our body cannot be in our backyard, the backyard right now that we had when we were kids. Nor could our body right now be on the surface of the moon. But our mind can imagine that, can have an awareness of that. So the qualities that the mind have is that the mind is what they call clear and knowing. Clear here refers to the basic capacity for the mind to give rise to appearances. Like when I said, imagine your backyard as a kid. In your mind gave rise to an appearance in your mind. You know, it wasn't like looking at a photograph, but there was an appearance in your mind of what your backyard was like when you were a kid. This is what the mind can do. It's clear. It can give rise to appearances. And the mind is knowing, and this refers to the mind's capacity to be aware of those appearances. To be aware of those appearances. While the activity of the brain does influence the appearances which arise in the mind, it cannot be said that the brain is the same thing as the mind. In a similar way, the thoughts and ideas which arise in the mind are able to influence electrical activity in the brain, which can lead to the formation of new neural pathways or can trigger particular physical behaviors. So the way Khenpo Rinpoche says it, he says the mind and the body are like two spheres of influence, right? Two spheres. And these spheres, they connect. They have an interconnecting place where they kind of correlate with one another, work with one another. So we're going to try this. To observe this in action, let's conduct a very simple experiment. No matter where you are right now, what you're doing right now, okay? Stop, raise your right arm, and lower it again. Good. All right, so let's look at what just happened in this seemingly simple action. Different vibrations of sound waves from my voice entered your outer ear and traveled through the ear canal to the eardrum, which transferred these vibrations to three tiny little bones, amplification bones. So the eardrum's hitting these three little amplification bones in the middle ear. These tiny amplifying bones send the sound vibrations to the cochlea, which is a snail-shaped structure in the inner ear filled with fluid. These sound vibrations caused the fluid inside the cochlea to start rippling, which caused a traveling wave to form along a membrane inside the cochlea that has sensory cells sitting on top of it. So you've got a membrane inside the cochlea, the fluid's moving, the sensory cells on top of the membrane are in this wave now. These sensory cells can detect a range of high-pitched to low-pitched sounds. As the sensory cells on top of the membrane were riding the wave of the cochlear fluid, microscopic hair-like projections on top of these sensory cells bumped up against an overlying structure within the cochlea, causing the microscopic hairs to bend back and forth. This bending causes pores at the tips of these hair-like projections to open up. When that happened, chemicals rushed in through the hairs into the sensory cells, creating electrical signals. The auditory nerve that's attached to the end of the cochlea carried these electrical signals to your brain, activating various neurons, which cause the awareness of sounds to arise in your mind. Cause the awareness of sounds to arise in your consciousness. The awareness of these sounds caused the awareness of their meaning as speech to arise in your mind, in your consciousness. This awareness of meaning then, in turn, triggered a pattern of neurons to fire off, and electrical pulses traveled through your nervous system into your arm, causing the muscles to contract, thus causing your arm to raise. Then, after a brief period of time passed, the memory of the meaning of what was heard triggered another chain reaction that resulted in the arm lowering. All of these little interactions between the body and the mind happened in an unbelievably short span of time, as you recall, so fast that we perceive them to be happening instantaneously. So this little activity, this little experiment demonstrates the way in which the two spheres of body and mind intersect to mutually influence each other according to the Buddhist model of the mind. Remember, this is according to the Buddhist model of the mind. Nobody's asking anybody to believe this. So one, there are three things that happened. One, at the physical level, the physical sphere, the physical level, an awareness of the sounds arise in your mind, or consciousness, we could say. B, you become aware of the meaning. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. At the physical level, A, sonic waves traveling through space. B, enter your ear. C, causing electrical signals to activate neurons in your brain. That's the first thing that happened, physical. 2, at the non-physical level, A, an awareness of these sounds arose in your mind or consciousness. B, you became aware of the meaning of the sounds. And C, this caused you to have a conscious intention to raise and lower your right arm. So that's at the non-physical level of consciousness, the other sphere. Then this goes back. 3, this intention of your consciousness directs the activity back to the physical sphere, the physical level. A pattern of neurons fires in your brain. B, causing electrical impulses to travel through your nervous system into your arm. C, causing the muscles to contract as you raise and lower your arm. So is that clear, just from the Buddhist model, how the consciousness and the physical are influencing one another and mutually intersected? Seems so. This same kind of mutual influence between the mind and the body can be observed in the way the physical body and the consciousness intersect to generate our experiences of taste, touch, sight, sound, and smell. There is always an element of awareness and consciousness involved in every one of those, what we would call senses. So Buddhism will say there is a sense organ, which is physical, the nose, the ear organ, the tongue. Those are physical, but there's also a sense consciousness and awareness that goes along with that. And these two function in very much the same way as this did, what we just went through.
So, Christopher, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go.
So I'm thinking about the difference between the mind and the consciousness. And of course, I think from a scientific perspective, the kind of brain-centered memory consciousness people would say this is all still a bunch of neurons that are selectively activated by a selective subset of electrical signals. And if you reactivate those over a period of time, you enforce the strength of the interaction at the synapses, and that really becomes then an embedded memory that is called upon when those neurons are fired off again. The awareness aspect is kind of what Buddhists are calling the consciousness, which is maybe separate from the physical brain. But if you are, say, a newborn versus an adult, and your level of consciousness is different between being a newborn and being an adult. You use the example of the backyard. So as a newborn, you have no concept, I would assume, of what a backyard is until you experience the backyard, and then somehow that experience is either stored again in the consciousness or in the brain. I'm not, and therefore the consciousness seems to continue to have to also develop somehow and retain information as part of this, part of its existence. So I'm wondering, and maybe you'll get to this, or from a Buddhist perspective, I mean, how do they explain the evolution or the development or the growth of consciousness in a vehicle, in a sentient being's vehicle, that is different than the idea that you have many neurons that you're born with, that as you develop, those neurons die, some grow, some become more interconnected. And so there is actually a structural physical basis for what we call memories or awareness or sensory experiences.
Yeah, the two, again, they work together. But at the level of what we would call conscious awareness and conscious experience, that is consciousness. Consciousness also develops habitual propensities for the way it the kinds of things that it's drawn to or aware of. And so consciousness itself can be a habitual thing, the same way the neurons develop the patterns, that so the two what I'm trying to say is the two work together, but the physical matter is not aware. The physical matter is not consciousness, and the neuroscientists have not yet been able to prove that it is. They have not yet been able to say, well, what is consciousness? What is awareness? They are trying to make it come somehow out of matter, and Buddhism is saying it doesn't come out of matter. They are
But
two.
I understand what Buddhism is saying, and I understand that, neuroscientists haven't identified structurally or physically what consciousness is. I get all that.
Okay.
I would only caution that just because you haven't found something or haven't discovered something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means you haven't had the capacity to see it yet.
I totally agree with you. I do.
But I guess I'm trying to understand, or trying to well, I guess I'm trying to understand kind of how, from a Buddhist perspective, these consciousness, which I understand is at different levels, but it still seems to have to change and be modified as one goes through a life of experiences. And somehow those experiences or those awarenesses or whatever you want to call them have to be retained somewhere in what is apparently so far, because I don't think anybody has discovered what Buddhist consciousness is either in that context, but it has to be retained. So I'm just trying to understand how these awarenesses, how these experiences, how these recollections are developed and maintained in a consciousness. If the two overlap and they work together, fine. I mean, I'm not trying to be I'm not trying to say anything, that I disagree with anything you're saying. I'm just trying to understand, and I'm hoping you will help me understand from the Buddhist perspective. Usually, they usually negate something to the existence, to the point where you have to say, well, it must be true because I can't find any other evidence, so therefore it must be what I think it is. But we live in a world where we want some necessarily positive affirmation or proof about the existence of something in some way that we can either interpret, see with our senses. So I know I'm rambling, so maybe I'm not making too much sense at this point. But
well, let me take your. I heard you say something. How can consciousness develop? And in consciousness, like everything else, Buddhism says there's no thing that exists that is permanent. Everything that exists is impermanent, meaning that it's constantly changing due to causes and conditions. So the consciousness is constantly changing. It's either developing strong propensities for being attached to things, attached to inherently existing things, or it's developing strong propensities to, see the dependent, really arising nature of things and not be so grasping and attached to that, to understand that things come and go due to causes and conditions, like we've been talking about with the two truths. So there is the propensity, obviously, of the consciousness to develop and change and modify.
So,
just as there is with the brain.
right, but let's go back to your example of the backyard again that you used, when you recall because you were there as a child. So you experience that through your, I'll call them conventional senses, but you experience those through your conventional senses.
Mm.
Somehow that experience, that awareness, that sensation, whatever you associate with it is retained somehow, I guess, in the consciousness in part, if not in whole. And then 30 years later in life, somehow you become aware of that same you become aware of that same awareness is what I was going to say, but I don't know exactly what the right word is to use, of your backyard.
Mm.
About memory and consciousness,
So-
two different things.
Okay, well, I got Tracy here trying to teach me as well. So I'm trying to figure out, in the dependently arising nature of reality, does this awareness of the backyard exist at the time you're aware of it and then disappears, and then some 30 years later the causes and conditions come together that says, oh, that existed? Or is that recollection or awareness of the backyard retained somehow, or maybe is a combination of both? There is memory that's physical about neurons and stuff like that, but the smell of the grass or the warmth of the sun or whatever is something that maybe is more in the consciousness sphere, and somehow that is brought back to you. I'm just trying to work through how this might work, given I live in a conventional existence. So I guess that was my original question.
Well, going back to the backyard example, for instance, if when you were a little baby, you probably even had no concept of backyard. If you were brought out into the backyard, there was no concept yet because you had not been taught language by your parents. You didn't know, you were just learning. So you're just basically taking in, the feeling of the air, the sun, this, whatever may appear to your eyes. But over time, as you grow up as a child, if you had a backyard, this is only going to work if you had a backyard and you've spent a lot of time in it, the consciousness becomes habituated to experiencing that backyard, experiencing being out there, playing in that backyard. So that's reinforced over and over again in the consciousness, and it makes an imprint on the consciousness. And so that consciousness can then, all you have to say is think of your backyard, and, you can think of that backyard, and there's an imprint there that arises. And there's almost like what you would call an appearance that arises in your mind. It's not like a photo, but it's some kind of an appearance. And this is what they would say is the conscious aspect. Of course, it works with the brain. Just like I said, it works with the physical brain. If, for instance, as a child, if you were deaf, if you were blind, if you were lacking one of your senses, the physical senses, then the consciousness could not function through those senses and have those experiences. It could only experience what it could consciously experience. Recall when we talked about Helen Keller, the things that she could experience is what she did experience, consciously. So they definitely are working together. Consciousness and form always work together. I mean, this goes back to the most subtle kind of form that exists would be a form of almost like biophoton type light, and then the consciousness, the awareness itself, and they are always connected. They're not the same thing, but they're always connected. According to Buddhism, it's not just like consciousness is by itself all the time. Consciousness is always connected to some form of subtle matter.
So, sorry.
Whether it's complex like a brain, or just simply what goes from lifetime to lifetime, down to the most subtle form.
So maybe I can ask a slightly different question. So from the Buddhist perspective, what is their evidence that consciousness is not the brain? I mean, I've
The
heard you
evidence,
say, yeah, go ahead. Go
the
ahead.
evidence from the yogi's perspective is their direct experience of it. Their direct experience of
Okay.
it.
All right.
That's the evidence. And also when they are you could almost say out of body experiences, out of the physical body. Anyone who's had an actual out of body experience will tell you, they were not in their body and yet they were experiencing things through their consciousness. But if you have not had an out of body experience, you would just say, oh, they're crazy. There must have been something wrong with them, something wrong with the brain. That's what one would say. So you have to have this experience yourself. The only thing that can, they say the only thing that can actually know the mind itself is something, the only thing that can know something that is non-physical is something non-physical. There will never be some kind of machine or device that will be able to measure something that is non-physical. What a machine or device can measure is something that can be measured, that's physically there. This is why we're measuring, we're looking at the neurons, we're looking at the brain matter, we're looking at the nervous system, we're looking at all of this stuff, trying to figure out how does consciousness, how does awareness arise out of this? Whereas Buddhism would say what we need to be doing is using consciousness itself to investigate consciousness. Because consciousness is non-physical, we cannot use something physical to actually investigate the nature of what is essentially non-physical.
Okay, well, I again, now I'm back to where if you have to have a experiential event, I guess I would call it, in order to understand it. To me,
How do you know you're not crazy?
well, no, I'm not going to say crazy. I'm just saying that, we've talked about this before, that, people can believe a variety of different things and believe that they're true because they think they've experienced them. But again, maybe that's true and maybe that's right. I'm not saying it's not, but on the other hand, if you can probably, if you're really good, you can train your mind to think in different ways or behave in different ways or observe things in different ways, and come to different conclusions about what is or what isn't. So that is the challenge, at least, for me, is to try to figure out how to do this without having the experiential aspect of it, but logic and reason it through.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I totally get it.
I just want to, I'm going to interrupt because I think at some point in our practice, I think, and this is what I have found, so I'm just going to share it. There comes a point when one realizes the importance of doing the types of practices that will lead to these direct experiences. Because as you're pointing out, Brian, until then, it's all just intellectual material. It's all just in the books, and it's all just, we're taking it on because we have some level of confidence in our teachers and in the lineage. We sort of take it on board. But I can say from my own point of view, I'm feeling increasingly a sense of, all right, I just need to understand more clearly the specific meditation practices that will bridge me to these experiences, because I can't go on forever just abiding with these intellectual concepts without the direct experience that will then bring me into this realm of this way of existing. So I mean, that's what I'm finding is like the questions like what you're asking, I feel for me will only be resolved if I do the work, the specific meditation work that is being advised based on the understanding of how to do the practices, and with the help and guidance of teachers like Geshe Nima, Because until then, it's just all an intellectual discussion. That's where I'm at with it.
I was going to say very much the same thing, Brian. From the standpoint where most of us are at, we actually haven't gone through all of the stages of meditation, the way it's described, the way it's carried down by these yogis. So we're very fortunate that that exists and that we can try that and practice it, but we have to try it. We have to practice it before we make, before we come to any conclusions. What we tend to do is, we do this with everything. We do this with everything. We want to make sure we get it right before we start. We want to make sure, get that right car before we start, get the right relationship before we enter into it. And then, we haven't thoroughly done the work. And so we begin to find that things aren't going well, things aren't going right, So we have to not just try to decide ahead of time how a meditation practice is going to lead us step by step through these stages. But we have to just have a little confidence that these yogis had something going on, that the Buddha had some kinds of insights, and that just to try it. And this is what I want us to do. This is what I'm doing with Khentrul Rinpoche's teachings, is start at the very beginning, what the mind is, and then gradually go through in detail these particular practices, the stages of meditation, so that we can actually begin ourselves to practice on a regular basis and get a sense of how this is actually working with our own mind. Because until we do that, what could we have but questions? What could we have? There's no way we can have faith in something we haven't tried. I mean, you can have a little bit of confidence that, you look at somebody like Geshe Nimo or Geshe Dragpo or the Dalai Lama, you go, well, yeah, they seem like really nice people. They must be doing something right, But that's as far as we can go with it. We can't really go, oh yeah, I know for sure, I believe everything because they seem like nice people. That's not good enough. It's not really good enough for Buddhism. I mean, the point is, first of all, to hear the teachings, to take them in, to contemplate them, think about them, and then to actually put them into practice on a regular basis. This is where most of us fail. Most of us fail to put these teachings into practice on a regular basis because we are too distracted by everything else going on. And it seems far more important than taking the time to do a regular practice, daily practice. So until we do that, we can't really make a judgment about this, and that would be my answer, And some of us are practicing. I know, Brian, you're doing things regularly, and I think it's wonderful. I absolutely, think it's great.
When I'm talking about practice.
But we have to get to a deeper level.
Yeah, I'm
deeper.
talking about the specific meditation techniques and processes that make it possible to have a direct realization.
Right.
Now, I'll just say in conversation with Geshe Nimo over the internet about this in the last several months, what he has said was your conduct, in other words, your altruism, and the way he used the term merit, your insight, your realizations come in direct correlation with how good a person you are.
Correct.
So how honest you are, how humble you are, how generous you are. When we were talking in the preliminary about the 6 paramitas, those are generosity, ethical behavior, patience or refraining from anger,
Meditative stabilization.
effort,
Joy.
enthusiasm, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And
wisdom.
of course, the last 2, meditative stabilization and concentration. So, or realizing emptiness. So he's saying, Geshe Nimo is telling me and us, us that find his teaching helpful, that if we are really serious about catapulting our experience past an intellectual appreciation to this realm of direct experience. Do those practices, keep studying, do the practices, keep studying, get nicer and nicer and nicer and more unbiased, love every single entity, keep studying and practicing as those things progress, and the more, and you know, the more we, you know, it takes a lot. I just again sharing my own experience. It's kind of like levels of getting real with myself over the years. And you know, recently I'll just share this one recent thing. Probably this idea was inspired by all the contention going on in the political realm in the world, not just here, but everywhere. And I just started developing, based on my study, this like feeling of simplistic relief that I could just decide to love all sentient beings without bias. I didn't have to go through a big, hairy, long process. I didn't have to analyze it. I could just take the understanding that His Holiness has shared time and time again in Geshe Nima and in Buddha, that all sentient beings, regardless of their trappings and costumes and personalities, they all want happiness and they all want to be free from suffering. And you know, if you've ever had, you know, I mean, I could go into it in more detail, but I've had it happen so many times in my life where somebody that I judged based on their appearance, their words, and affiliations, when I got to know them and understand what they were really about, it was a very humbling experience. And so I'm almost for myself just cutting to the chase. That even as warped, in my opinion, as some views are, from the side of the person with what I label as a warped opinion, that person actually thinks that is the correct way for humanity to go. And so we somehow have to push ourselves to keep this unbiased thing is really a big hairy deal, because if you read into some of this material more deeply, for example, the 37 practices of the Bodhisattva, one of the things we refer to, you'll see implied but also stated that with bias, as long as bias is present, your merit, this factor that is required to up your direct realization potential, is just stuck. As long as you have bias, you think your group is right and the other group is wrong. It really takes a lot. And I mean, we've been being taught, you know, I've had so many teachers give me, one of my favorite, one teacher was held up a bunch of magic markers. They were all different colors. And of course, he said, now what colors do you see? And so depending on where you're standing, you see it completely differently. And we have to get to where we literally have to get to a completely new way of seeing that is frightening, because it means letting go. In some ways, it's like letting go of the line on the dock and letting the boat just drift away from the dock, and it'll be okay. Anyway, I feel, obviously I'm going through a lot right now with this, because I think part of it has to do with just age. You go, I don't have forever to figure this out. And you know, having been following specific spiritual paths towards enlightenment since forever, since I can remember, you know, in my early teens. Okay, I mean, at some point I have to go past thinking that it's neat and willing to like actually dig into my guts and make some significant progressive change in terms of what does unbiased altruism really mean. You know, I don't know. Anyways, I've talked enough. But anyways,
this,
going back to the
That's a
direct
point.
realizations will come to the extent that you get there.
that point is very well made. All the teachers say that. The realizations won't come unless we have developed enough positive potential is another way of putting it. Positive potential. And
You know,
that comes through engaging in the very initial practices that the Buddha told us to engage in, which are these 10 virtuous actions and avoiding these 10 non-virtuous actions. And the process the process of doing that, the process of replacing killing with protecting life, the process of replacing divisive speech with inclusive speech, but practicing this on a regular basis to go through all of these, your mind begins to shift. You begin to see, if I do these 10 virtuous actions and stop doing these negative ones, which are very easy for all of us to do, it's going to change the way I think about others, the way I look upon the world. My mind will start to clear up. And so the point of these initial practices that the Buddha gave is that the mind clears up, and it enables us then to look at the Dharma in a fresh way, in a like Kavita was saying, in a non-biased way, with an open mind, not a gullible mind. We should always question, always question. We should not have a gullible mind, but have an open mind that can look at this and then decide for ourselves. But it won't come if we just hear the information and don't put the information into practice. That's the main message of this last 10 minutes, really. So I'll continue then. I think we covered a lot of things just in this talk right now, which Khenpo Rinpoche had talked about. Anyway, Khenpo Rinpoche says that the only thing that's capable of detecting a non-physical phenomenon directly is another non-physical phenomenon, in this case, the mind itself. The great yogic meditators of the past, such as Shakyamuni Buddha, have made great efforts to develop a range of mental techniques for directly observing the mind. This is where we're headed with these series of studies on the mind and understanding the mind. Through prolonged practice and engagement with these techniques, these yogis learned that the mind could be trained and conditioned to demonstrate specific desirable qualities. Through working with the mind, they were able to completely transform the way in which they related with their world. And this is what we want to do, isn't it? I mean, we want to be able to transform the way we relate with our world in a way that is very positive, very uplifting, very beneficial, joyful, inclusive. I mean, it's very difficult for us to learn to be inclusive, but it's going to take practice. And if we can begin to practice it, we can begin to do it. And if we practice it enough, it'll get habitual with us, and it will just be the way we are. And we won't push anybody away, even the most vile, disgusting being that we can imagine will go, I just want that being to be happy, and I don't want that being to suffer. And if there's anything I can do to help that occur, I want to be able to do that. That's where we would like to get, rather than I don't know, finding fault all the time, finding fault and disagreeing and fighting. And I mean, look at the world. We don't want that. Obviously, we don't want that. So Buddhism is presenting a path out of that, and it's just up to us to decide. Do we want to work with all the material that's here and the way it appears to us physically and try to change everything from the outside in, or do we want to change it from the inside out? Change it from the level of consciousness and how we perceive things. And Buddhism says the way to change it is at the level of consciousness. So this is, to me, it definitely is worth the try. I've been trying it, and I can see the changes that have occurred in my mind, I'm not the person I was when I was 20 years old. Not at all. Really quite different. A lot of the things are the same, but there are many, many things that have changed due to spiritual practices. So that's all. That's what I'll say about that. So going forward, these great meditators devoted their lives to discovering the true nature of the mind. They gave up all worldly comforts and pleasures, as well as concern for name and fame, to discover this hidden true nature and to understand all of the phenomena related to the mind. So in the continuing series of upcoming sessions, what we're going to do is explore the discoveries that these yogis have made through Khentrul Rinpoche's presentation, which I said is very, very clear. And we'll just do this in increments. So part of every class, part of every session at the beginning will be having to do with the mind, having to do with stages of meditation, and very, very slowly taking all of this on board, because you cannot grasp it all in one sitting. You just can't. And it requires, we have to think about it. We have to contemplate it. We have to go back and remind ourselves of what is being said here. It just doesn't come like that. It's not like that at all. So we're going to take it slowly and do it as a group, and hopefully, we're going to see some progress as a group. So now what we're going to do is we're going to resume where we left off with Nagarjuna's Precious Garland. That was yeah.
Well, the thought that came to mind when you say that the non-physical cannot measure the physical, or the physical cannot measure the non-physical, what comes to mind, and I have discovered this by observing my own consciousness, is time. Time is not measurable, and yet we created a system in which we measure the year, we measure days, we measure 24 hours, minutes, seconds. We made it up. But when I look at a microwave, time is different because it's very slow. Or even this is fast. It happens fast. So we do create ways in which we think we're measuring the non-measurable. So that was just an example that came to mind. And when you say about we don't want others to suffer, the dilemma that I have discovered by observing my own mind is I cannot make other people stop suffering. I can only stop the suffering within me through my own mind, through my own consciousness. And maybe when people observe my behavior or hear my words or perceive my attitude, maybe they will reconsider the way they think. But I really cannot change someone else's mind or someone else's consciousness. They have to change their own consciousness. So I feel the dilemma of there's no rescuing, I cannot do things for others. They have to do them for themselves. And that's what I love about Buddhism, because in Christianity, you go and rescue people and like, poor you, let me help you. And so when we think about all people suffering, we really cannot do much, can we?
Oh, no, Josefina, you're so right. I mean, if the Buddha, I've always said this, if the Buddha could have relieved all of our suffering, it would have happened a long time ago. But it's one consciousness at a time. And what happens is, for each one of us, I think this comes at a different point. I don't know. But we've had enough. We've had enough suffering. We've had enough of things not going right. And we go, there must be something better. And that's when people start turning to spiritual paths to see what could, maybe this has some answer for me. And that's where Buddhism can be helpful, because Buddhism teaches people how to do this for themselves. Because that's the only way. You're absolutely right. That's the only way. We cannot hit somebody over the head and make them happy. It's just not going to work. It's not going to work. Yeah, it's a very good observation. Again, the one about time. How many of us have experienced that? Waiting for the microwave, the time. And it seems like this is going on forever, and it's only just a minute. And yet other times a minute could go like that. So the time is a very, very flexible thing, and we do try to measure it. And the measurement helps to some degree, where it helps us to sort of keep things going in an orderly fashion to a degree, but it's not actually measuring the real experience of time. It's kind of superimposed over it. And that's a good example that you gave. So now moving on to Nagarjuna. And reading this, I realized why I stopped and we decided, all right, we need to talk about the two truths. And I hope some of that has stuck. I hope some of that will, that when we get back to Nagarjuna, we're just not going to go, oh my God, I don't understand this anymore. So this is kind of where we left off, okay? You may remember this, may not remember it. We left off, we completed in session 28. We're now at session 36 or something. We completed stanza 42. And this is with Kensur Jampa Tekchok's commentary of Nagarjuna's Precious Garland. So here's where we start up again. And we were talking about nirvana. And if you recall, we were talking about nirvana, which means cessation of suffering, I guess you might say. Nirvana being a cessation of suffering, and that there's a nirvana with remainder and nirvana without remainder. This may sound distantly familiar. It may not sound familiar at all. According to the lower schools of the Buddhist tenets, and this would be the Vaibhashika and Sautrantaka, those are the Theravadan schools. They are the less subtle of the schools. Sometimes they're called lower, according to those schools, when practitioners of the hearer and solitary realizer vehicles, the hearer is somebody who hears the teachings and then based on those teachings can attain liberation from suffering. Solitary realizer is somebody who hasn't even heard the teachings, but just on their own realizations, they are able to release themselves from suffering. You might say, you could say, if you just took Shakyamuni Buddha's life as being the only life he ever had, you could say he was a solitary realizer. But according to all of the teachers, that last life that he lived as Shakyamuni Buddha was designed to just show us a way, to be an example. And the Buddha had done many lifetimes, just like us, of getting to that point. So what it means is for these hearers and solitary realers, they obtain what they call nirvana without remainder. And see if you remember any of this. This means that although they're liberated from the suffering of cyclic existence, they still remain in their bodies that are under the influence of the afflictions and contaminated karma of cyclic existence. When their bodies eventually die, their self and aggregates, including their subtle continuums of consciousness, completely cease and are forever extinguished. This is called nirvana without remainder by these less subtle schools. So in other words, once you've had this direct realization of emptiness, and then you've done the meditation work and become an arhat, and that you're completely ceased all suffering, then when you die, it's over. Lights out, no consciousness. It's just you're extinct. You're extinct. And that's the view that's the Theravada view. And we actually have met people, Theravada Buddhists who say that's the case. That's what they're working towards, just extinction. Because with extinction, there can be no suffering whatsoever. According to the highest Prasangika Madhyamika school of tenets, nirvana is the cessation of grasping at inherent existence. This is what is being ceased. We stop grasping at things as if they existed independently from their own side. We begin to see things as codependent arisings. Remember when we talked about the book? The book appears to be this independently self-existing thing, but when it's actually analyzed, even from the most mundane point of view, you can see that the book doesn't exist on its own at all. It's the culmination of infinite causes and conditions. So things exist that way. This is the way, and so when we stop grasping onto the inherent existence of the book or the inherent existence of me, this is when we have this, what they call this is what nirvana is, the cessation of grasping at inherent existence. But the Prasangikas say inherent existence never existed in the first place. Nothing exists that way. if we actually analyze it, we see that inherent existence is a mistaken view. Things just don't exist that way. Nirvana, like emptiness, is a non-affirming negative. It's a mere absence that doesn't imply anything else in its place. Nirvana is not a thing, it's not a place, it's not a state of mind. This is all the Prasangika view. Nirvana isn't even a non-thing, because that would imply an existence in relationship to a thing. Nirvana is nothing but a cessation, and that cessation is permanent. And that's about the only thing you could say that Buddhism would say is permanent. Anything that exists is not permanent. So in other words, what Buddhism is saying, that inherent existence doesn't exist. It never existed. It never will exist. And as long as we continue to grasp at it, to think that we exist that way and that other things exist that way, we are going to generate all of these afflictive emotions that cause all of the trouble that we have for ourselves and for others. And it's this view that's the problem, this view that is completely mistaken. Now, we didn't get to this now, and this took me a while to figure out, and I'm not sure I figured it out, but I'll share it with you. This is about two kinds of purity in nirvana. According to the Prasangikas, there are two kinds of purity in nirvana: natural or innate purity, which is the emptiness of inherent existence that has always been present, and adventitious, sort of added on, or non-innate purity, which is the emptiness of inherently existent, dependently co-arising karmic stains that are imprinted on the mental continuum. So what is this saying? What is this saying? Here, the purity, when they're using the word purity here, they're referring to emptiness, that nothing exists inherently, that everything is a dependent co-arising, like the book is a dependent co-arising of infinite causes and conditions. So when they're talking about the innate purity, they're talking about innate state of emptiness of inherent existence. So there is an innate state that everything is actually dependently co-arising, coming in and out of existence due to causes and conditions. That is the innate nature, you might say, of reality. So when they're talking about the non-innate purity, they're talking about how sentient beings, due to a misunderstanding of the nature of reality, in other words, we grasp on to inherent existence. We think inherent existence is so. Even when we first conceptually get the idea that maybe it's not so, we're still doing it out of habit. We're so accustomed to this inherent existence that we still have not let go of it. So what that does, because nothing actually exists inherently, and everything exists as codependent arisings or co-arising dependent arisings, because we have a wrong view, what we're doing is we generate all of these afflictive emotions based on thinking everything exists inherently the way it appears to me, and therefore I'm angry at so-and-so. I'm just completely dissatisfied with my surroundings. I need something new. And we start getting into the situation that we see has escalated in the world and has always been there in the world and will continue until there is until each one of us begins to turn it around. So we see all the wars and the suffering and the killing and the hating and the disagreement and blah, 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 because we are grasping onto things as if they should exist independently this way, and they're not the way I like it. So when it's saying that we have a non-innate purity, it's saying that because we have grasped at things as existing independently when they don't actually exist that way. We have generated all this kind of negative karma and afflictive emotions and these what they call karmic stains or stains, imprints of karmic stains on our mental continuum. However, all of those karmic stains, all of that frustration and anger and jealousy and war and killing and all of that are actually empty of any kind of inherent existence. They do not exist inherently. They are not independently self-existent. They also exist, come into existence due to causes and conditions that co-arise. So in that sense that all of those karmic stains are actually dependent arisings, then that it is a kind of they call non-innate purity. It has the empty, it's empty. It also has emptiness in it. All these karmic stains are empty of inherent existence. However, even though they have this non-innate purity of being empty of inherent existence, they are generating suffering. And so we have to figure out what to do about that. But that was I don't know if that made sense. A little bit of sense. I had to think a lot about it when I read it.
What strikes me is I'm not sure why they make the difference, because in
Well-
the end, they're the same thing.
I think the reason they're making the difference is that what they're trying to tell us is that all of this can be changed. It's not because these things, these karmic stains that we have, these wrong views, don't exist inherently. It means it can change. And so that's where we should think about purity as meaning emptiness.
Okay.
These things are empty of inherent existence. And if we generate the causes and conditions to turn all of that around, we can undo the karmic stains. We can change all of this. But we have to stop grasping at inherent existence, and begin
Yeah,
to
okay.
realize the way things do
I
exist.
get it. So it's sort of a psychological tool.
Nothing but psychological.
Yeah.
Buddhism is psychological.
Mhm.
So the word purity refers to the emptiness of inherent existence, whether it's innate or non-innate. Ordinary beings have innate purity since their minds by nature are empty of inherent existence. While ordinary beings have no stains of inherent existence and no inherently existent stains, they haven't yet extinguished their adventitious, meaning added on, dependently arising afflictions and karma. And because of this, ordinary beings have not yet realized the emptiness of inherently existent karmic stains imprinted on the mental continuum. They haven't realized the emptiness of those karmic stains, the emptiness of all of our problems, in other words. Those problems don't exist inherently. Those problems can be turned around if we generate the causes and conditions for those problems to be turned around, which is why going back to the initial practices of these virtuous as opposed to non-virtuous actions is so key, so elemental, so fundamental. It's the Buddha's first teaching, and we have to be doing that. It's really profound, and it makes a difference. In nirvana, there are neither inherently existent stains nor dependently arising adventitious stains in nirvana, in cessation, in other words. There is simply the emptiness of inherent existence. In this way, words like true cessation, nirvana, liberation, and peace, they're all empty of inherent existence. There is no inherently existing peace. There is no inherently existing nirvana. When it is said that nirvana is the extinguishing of afflictions, it not only means that dependently arising afflictions have been extinguished, but also that there are no inherently existent afflictions in nirvana. This absence of inherently existent afflictions is the ultimate truth of emptiness. According to the highest Prasangika Madhyamika school of tenets, nirvana is the cessation of grasping at inherent existence. But inherent existence itself has never existed. Nirvana, like emptiness, is a non-affirming negative, a mere absence that doesn't imply anything in its place. Nirvana is not a thing, it's not a place, not a state of mind. So there, we got about 4 minutes left. And I'm not going to go further with this. I think that's enough because that's a lot to think about. And I think it's kind of where we were beginning to get hung up because we hadn't really gone through a thorough, somewhat, let's say, a more in-depth analysis of the two truths than we had. And because this was not put in the commentary in Nagarjuna's Precious Garland, yet it was brought up, which is why I felt that we had to pull away from the Garland and focus on the two truths to sort of get our minds in a place where we might be able to start comprehending what's being said. And I guess my question is, does any of this make sense to those of you who have been studying with us, consistently? Does any of this, what we just read about nirvana and non-inherently existing karmic stains, that all of that can be turned around? Does any of that make sense? Or does it just sound like I hear the words, but I don't know what you're saying? Because if it's just I hear the words and I don't know what you're saying, then we need to find a way to understand. Because we can't really go forward if we don't have an idea of what is meant by grasping at inherent existence and why that's a problem. I remember I asked this, maybe I asked this a couple of weeks ago. Why would it be a problem? Why would grasping at inherent existence cause suffering? And everybody was silent. There was no answer. There was no conclusion. And I'm wondering still now, if I ask this question, why would grasping at inherent existence cause suffering? Does anybody have an answer? In it, you say whatever you think, because unless I just want to hear from somebody. Does anybody have even an inkling of why grasping at inherent existence would cause suffering?
Because desire is the source of suffering.
And why is that? Desire for what?
Preference for what things should be like. So there's attachment and aversion. Attachment is I want things to continue being the way I like them. Aversion is I don't like things the way they are and I want them to end. I want them to be the way I want them. And so my translation of everything you said is loving what is. That's it.
Is what?
Loving what is the way it is because it is, to surrender to what is.
Yeah, that's not a bad answer, really. Really, that's a pretty good one. The thing where we have trouble is we go, how can we love what is? How can we love the results of war, right? Say, bombing a city and all these babies and families, they get all killed. And how can we love what is?
Well, death is part of the illusion. Death is just a transition. So why should death be a tragedy? Why should I be attached to people never dying? Death is part of the human existence. Illness is part of the human existence. Cancer, hurricanes, volcanoes, earthquakes, they are part of the human experience. And we just need to accept them for what they are because they're actually out of my control anyway. So whether I like it or not, they will continue happening.
What? And that's true. That's actually, I mean, they will talk about this when we are looking at the kind of life we have, the human existence that we have, and samsara. The drawbacks are that it is filled with this suffering. The suffering is based on the wrong view of grasping, and so this entire samsaric system arose out of this mistaken view. So when we see something from a Buddhist point of view, whether it's the people falling out of the buildings at 9/11, crashing to their death, or the children being, bombed in Gaza and killed. The Buddhist view of this is a much longer, wider, expansive view, which takes into account all of cyclic existence and the consciousnesses that have been cycling in existence since beginningless time. So from a Buddhist point of view, when you look at a perpetrator and you look at a victim, say a war, right? So you have, not only do you have compassion for the victim, because the victim, from a karmic point of view, is receiving the result similar to the cause of something they themselves had done at another time. It's sort of like this, the way karma works, and it keeps like cycling through. So as outrageous as that sounds, you have compassion for the victim, understanding they are experiencing the results of something they generated the causes for. You also have compassion for the perpetrator, because they're also caught in this cycle, and they have just done an incredibly negative karmic action that is going to reap the results for them in the future. So they're also going, so this cycle of this, you could say cycle of violence, cycle of hatred, cycle of all of this that's going on, is a result of the wrong view, grasping at things like, I want it this way, get out of my way, I'm just going to destroy you. Ultimately, that's what it gets to. I'm going to end the relationship, we're getting a divorce, I hate you, to somebody who you once loved, were mad head over heels. But it all changes because they're not giving you what you want. So that goes back to what you're saying about the desire of what we want. And we are confused. We're confused about what we want because we're grasping onto things as if they exist inherently. And we don't like the way we don't like that. If we could see the causes and conditions, if we could understand the causes and conditions of what's going on, we would develop great compassion and do whatever we could to better ourselves to the point where we had enough capacity to be able to help others, with the Buddhist path. And it's something for all of us to think about, but really, I would advise thinking about this a lot. Why would grasping at inherent self-existence cause us suffering and cause suffering for others? To really think that through and take the long view of the Buddhist perspective. You have to put it within the context of Buddhism for it to make sense. Otherwise, it sounds outrageous. Okay. I guess we'll stop here. And closing prayers?
Let's just do the bodhicitta, may the precious Bodhi mind.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one's here on may the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. May the view of emptiness, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. And then we don't usually say this one, but let's say the prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the long life prayer.
Okay.
And the reason I'm mentioning His Holiness the Dalai Lama, it's sometimes very inspiring to think about all of the Buddhist teachers alive on the planet today find so much inspiration from his example. As a practitioner, as a consistent voice for love and compassion and equanimity. I mean, it's incredible. Anywhere you go in the Buddhist world, all forms of Buddhism, you'll see such devotion and inspiration. And so we are very fortunate to be alive on the planet in a time when somebody such as His Holiness has inspired and encouraged millions and millions of practitioners to get on the path, stay on the path, and make progress on the path. So, in the snowy mountain paradise, you are the source of all goodness and happiness. Powerful Tenzin Gyatso Chenrezig, may you stay until samsara ends. And then the final dedication, we'll skip the Lama Tsongkhapa and just go to the final dedication. In all my lives, this one is so important. In some ways, I feel like I've always felt this from the beginning. This is perhaps the most important as a practitioner, to hold this intention very, very close to your heart. In all my lives, may I not be separated from true lamas, and so enjoy the splendor of Dharma, fully perfecting the virtues of levels and paths. May I speedily attain the state of Vajradhara, and Vajradhara being sort of the essential guru Buddha that we all have the capacity to develop into.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Tracy says yes.
Okay, so next week we'll do more on the mind, Khenpo Rinpoche's on the mind, and we'll continue with Nagarjuna's precious Garland. And hopefully it will make more sense.
Quick reminder, Geshe Nima is coming, assuming he gets his visa.
Yeah.
I know Brian is on the front lines working.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah.
All right, everybody.
Okay, we'll see you all later.